And now it is my pleasure to introduce Peter DeWitt. The audience may not know, hopefully maybe some of you are podcast listeners, but Peter and I spend a lot of time talking to one another, and I'm thrilled to be presenting him tonight. So let me begin. I don't think tonight's guest needs much of an introduction, but I'm going to give a little one anyway. Peter is a premier leader of school leaders and educators. He is the author of many best-selling books for Corwin. He hosts a podcast called Leaders Coaching Leaders and is a featured blogger for EdWeek. And there he also has a podcast called A Seat at the Table. So I am actually Peter's editor, and I'm an editor here at Corwin, and I have had the honor of working rather closely with Peter on several projects this year. And during this time, he has managed to turn me into even a bigger fan. And this is because Peter is committed to making research practical, being responsive to what school leaders need on the ground, and remaining a lifelong learner. You know, Peter really practices what he preaches. And in keeping with this, tonight will be no different. Peter's going to respond to educators' need for reclaiming their time, their focus, and really an effort to reconnect with their why. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Peter to present on de-implementation, creating the space to focus on what works. Everyone enjoy.
Tanya, thank you so much. I'm so honored that so many of you would join. Bill, it's really nice to see you here from Illinois, seeing friends and from all over, all over the world, which is really fantastic. So I'm really honored that you would spend time with me. As Tanya said, I don't want to wait till the end to get questions. So this is the way I would like to roll, if it's okay with you. I would love for you to keep the chat box fired up. If you have questions, if you want to chat about something that I say, if you want to engage with each other, please know I would love to see you do that, because it's really important. And I always keep my eye on the chat box. You also probably notice at the top of the screen, you see www.menti.com. And you see the code 4892-1335. And the reason why I'm highlighting that is because for those of you who don't know what Mentimeter is actually an online engagement tool, and it's completely anonymous. So what I'd love for you to be able to do is, if you're on your computer, open up a separate tab and just go to www.menti.com and you use the code 4892-1335, which is just for us, just for tonight, or for those of you in Australia tomorrow morning. But if you use a phone, and you can certainly use your phone, and Melissa from Corwin actually put the Menti information in the chat box. But if you use your phone, I do have a QR code coming up on the next slide. So I want to invite you to be able to do that, because a couple of things. Number one, I'm going to share some success criteria with you, but I want you to actually share your success criteria with me. And in order to do that, I need you to sign up through Mentimeter. And so this is the code through the computer, but if you want to use your QR code, just like you would use a QR code for a menu at a restaurant, you can certainly do it here. And I think we'll start to notice that people are engaging with us through Mentimeter, because you will see the heart right like that, just on time. Thank you so much. Because I really do want to make sure that you're engaging with me. So while people are doing this, why don't I just share some information? There are a few ways that we're going to communicate with one another. One is through the chat box. If you don't want to use Mentimeter, I'm totally fine with that. And your name's tied to it, and I'd love to be able to interact with you that way. And I think people on here would like to interact with you as well. And like we said, we've got people from all over the world, which is really awesome. So it's a great opportunity to engage and learn from each other. I'm also going to be using Mentimeter as a way to communicate, which you're signing up for right now. And that's going to be a way that I share my success criteria, but you're going to be able to engage with me and tell me what your success criteria is as well. And then there are going to be a few spaces that I'm going to want to be able to hear from you because of the fact that, I'm going to ask you what you might want to de-implement as we go through. So thank you very much for joining. And just to give some people a few more seconds to sign up through Mentimeter, I'm going to say hi to Kisa, Highline Public Schools in South King County, Washington. I just came back from Seattle last week, so where I work as a lead advisor for you directors of teaching and learning. So thank you for being here. Ventura County, California, Belchertown, Massachusetts, so a neighbor of mine to the east, and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Melbourne, Australia, Norman, Oklahoma, lots of friends from Oklahoma, which is really nice. And Crystal, hello from New York. Thank you for being here. Really appreciate it. And Michael, Victoria, Australia. So really awesome. Here's the thing. You can continue to sign up through Mentimeter if you feel comfortable, because you'll see the code at the top. This is what I would like to ask you, though. And we're going to use the chat box for this one. We're going to look at this piece of data that's up here. And you know, I learned this a little bit from Joe Bowler with the whole idea of data talks. And I want you to look at this, and for just like a minute, and I'm going to keep quiet for a minute, for just a minute, I want you to look at this graph. And then in the chat box, this is what I would like you to do. Talk to me about what you notice. What do you wonder? What do you think is going on in the picture? So once again, I'm going to give you a minute to process, but what do you notice? What do you wonder? What is going on in this picture? And start putting it in the chat box. Be brave tonight or tomorrow morning. Give you about 20 more seconds. All right, so I'm hoping that was about a minute. I was looking at my watch at the time. So Julie, you started. Thank you for kicking it off. After COVID, more people considered leaving. Alessandra, sometimes. Sandy, many planning to stay. More than one news outlets lead us to believe. Kelly, the graph scale y-axis is weird. Thank you for that. Sorry about that. Especially if they were close to retiring due to COVID, more 55 and over. Bill, we must be more concerned with social and emotional issues of staff. There's still many educators who want to stay. I noticed that there is a high percentage of no, yet it says many teachers considered leaving. And some were saying yes. And to that, the high percentage were the people that said no, they were going to stay. Okay. COVID and other reasons are pretty similar. Firstly, there are many older teachers who were interested in leaving. I wonder what the other reasons are for leaving. The percent are about even among the groups. Kisa, this doesn't feel as bad as what I hear in the media. I can see that the N is relatively small, but still, Megan, about 50-50. Sandy, data is from March 2021. More has happened. Absolutely. Workload issues, but many choosing to stay. That's enormous turnover. If that many people follow through and do leave the profession. So Susanna, much to what you were saying, Sandy, and I agree. I was looking for the most recent data possible, and this is what I came across. And I searched for quite a while today, actually. But when you start to look at what we've been hearing over the past year or two, this is something that we do have to be concerned about. If you had the first two yes, how do they compare with the no? Longer tenure, more ready to leave with COVID. COVID took a toll. Turnover is enormous. I know that many of you are feeling this way. Kelly Webster, a friend of mine who is actually in the school district where I used to teach a long time ago. I'm actually surprised it's not more. This is just those that are considering, curious of the demographic. Okay. And I wonder how many of the people who considered leaving did leave. So what I wanted to be able to do just for a few minutes is kind of just to get our minds going, because I wanted to sort of help our mindset when we start to look at de-implementation. There are a lot of ways to actually look at de-implementation. But one of the things that I want to be able to focus on tonight for all of you is the importance of just this, engaging in a conversation, much like you're doing in the chat box. It's going to be messy. We're going to look at this data. We're going to consider a lot of different perspectives and stuff. And the thing about de-implementation that is really important is that it's not always simple. It's about let's actually get together and start talking about what does our workday look like? What does our workload look like? Where are there issues that we might need to actually carve off of? That's why I wanted you to be able to look at this down, our time together tonight. By the end of this session, I want you to be able to define de-implementation. I want you to describe how our locus of control could impact our decision-making. I want you to define what constitutes some things like low-value practices. And I want you to differentiate between informal and formal de-implementation. And then also, by the end of this session, you're going to be able to describe 2 types of de-implementation. So that's what I want. That's my success criteria for our time together. What I would like to know is, what is your success criteria? We had about 600 people sign up to be a part of this. So what I would like for you to do, and you can use the chat box or you can use Mentimeter, what is your success criteria? Take a minute and think, what brought you here? When you leave here this evening, what is it you want to have learned? And we're starting. Finding the core issues that I'll invest myself into. Thank you for putting that. Thank you for being the first. I will be successful if I can identify programs on my site that require de-implementation. Very good. Bill, how to turn the issues of de-implementation into opportunities. Bill, I always love your way of thinking. I want to reflect on ways I can shift the focus to what matters most. Thank you for putting that as well. Understanding the theory of de-implementation and working on what is important to be successful, learning how to make shifts in practices. My success criteria is to give me a standard on how the best aid teachers in creating stronger instructional lessons while not adding more work. I'm glad you put that as well. So let's try to work all of this in, right? Today, I will have wanted to learn about how to prioritize the work when we believe everything is critical to student learning and success, a better understanding about how to declutter. I want to have learned ways and methodologies to streamline my practice. Okay, you're giving me a lot, and I'm totally challenged and I'm ready for this tonight. More about how I can use this as a strategy to help my teachers find a hope in the work. That is awesome, because I've worked with some leaders lately that have said they've lost their why. So it's definitely something that we want to be able to keep. It's definitely a great place to focus. Ideas for sustainability through de-implementation. These are so good. How to put de-implementation into practice to have a high impact on student life, learning, realizing what can and should be de-implemented, how to make it happen, gain insights into how to ensure that the de-implementation process is successful in the long run. That's right. The ineffective practices are successfully stopped. How de-implementation and increase teacher engagement in PD. How can help district leaders better facilitate? Want to grow fast so that I focus on the work. Be able to define the implementation, learn ways to implement. Catherine, in the chat box, how to impress upon the executives who make the decisions but do not necessarily teach to declutter the curriculum and stop putting celebration days and a number of other time pressures into the teaching day. Just this morning, our federal new education minister was talking live on morning TV about professional lesson plans. Yes, and Catherine, I'm assuming you're coming from Australia because that's a huge topic that I've been talking about. Susanna, I've been keen to understand how the evidence on de-implementation applies in school setting, what's directly applicable from the med social science research and what's unique to education. I will certainly try to help you with that as well, Susanna. So I'm going to, move on with this. And one of the things so this whole idea of de-implementation for me came about in the conversation more than a year and a half ago. And it was like an earworm that I just couldn't get out. It was something that I wanted to explore more and more because in my coaching role, I do a lot of school leadership coaching. I work with a lot of people that feel and are overworked. I run workshops where you've got teachers that are just stressed out. I write for Education Week. I run a web show for Education Week called A Seat at the Table. EdWeek has done a lot of research over the past few years on the increased stress and anxiety the teachers and leaders have felt. In fact, last fall of 2021, teachers felt more stressed about the school year than they did the year before, which was a height of COVID without a vaccine. So there are a lot of these factors. And as a writer for Education Week, I've done a lot of work on social emotional learning. I come from an elementary background. So when I heard about de-implementation, there was an area of interest. And Susanna, much like your question, one of the things that I always go into is I go into this as a learner. Okay, so this comes from the medical field, which you're all going to see in just a minute. But what does this mean for us in education? And I'm always looking to make those kind of connections. But what I'd like to build on first is the fact that even some of you in the chat box, some of you in the Mentimeter, we're talking about your school administrators or school leaders, or when you go to conferences. What I have found in the past year and a half that I've been doing the research on this, it's really helped change my mindset and how I present, how I facilitate workshops. Because it's very easy for us to pay a lot of money and go to conferences and hear from speakers. And I've worked with a lot of leaders especially, that go to conferences to come away with a new strategy. My thinking is when we want to start having that mindset around de-implementation, there are a couple of ways that we have to approach when we go to professional learning. There are two ways. Number one, are we going to walk away with a new strategy? Sometimes I feel like those strategies are repackaged, and we have to be careful of that. There isn't a shiny new toy. There isn't a silver bullet that's going to save all of us. So we have to be very careful of that. But in the same way, new strategies can help us actually become more impactful. I used to flip my faculty meetings and focus on learning. That's a strategy people seem to like when they walk away with. But the second way to approach professional learning, and this is a mindset change before we even get into the de-implementation, is the idea that we have to go in and look at how we can inform our own thinking. Now, I have to be honest with you, a strategy that I would love for all of you to walk away with from today is developing success criteria with your faculty. Do it at the faculty meeting, do it in an instructional leadership team meeting, do it at your PLC meeting. Because if we truly want to engage in deep discussions around de-implementation and abandoning low-value practices, then in order to do that, people have to feel like they have a voice in the first place, and developing success criteria is the way to be able to do that. Now, I want you to think, because a lot of you came with a reason, and let's start with an adaptive challenge, because I guess the way I was trying to approach it tonight is, what's the problem you're trying to solve? What is the problem you're trying to solve that you're hoping de-implementation will help you with? And in a minute, I'm going to ask you to put that into Mentimeter. So my friend Jenny Donahue, who I do a lot of work with, and Stephen Katz, somebody she writes with quite often, talk about adaptive challenges. And you can see what it is up on the screen. It's an issue that raises a question. There might be a conceptual gap. There's something that maybe you just can't figure out. That's an adaptive challenge. And for you to jump into the whole idea of de-implementation, what is that problem you're trying to solve? What is the adaptive challenge that brings you here today? I saw your success criteria. I saw what you wanted to, that part of what you wanted to walk away with. This is the other part of the puzzle where you actually tell me, what's the problem you're trying to solve? I'll give you about 30 seconds to start. I know some of you will be able to jump in very quick. And part of the problem might just be that you're feeling a high sense of burnout, or you're feeling anxiety, or something like that. But what is the problem you're trying to solve, and you think de-implementation is going to help you? How to get middle school students to care about learning. One of the most profound pieces of research I found where that is concerned is from Odutola from 1972. Odutola found that our students are alienated from our schools, or they feel alienated because, number one, they don't feel like they have an emotional connection to their teacher or school, or number two, they don't feel like they have a voice in their own learning. And middle school is definitely a place where that happens. Better engagement for true learning. I feel like most of the practice I'd like to remove are mandated through legislation, and that definitely happens. But remember, just because you're stuck with their policies doesn't mean you need to be stuck with their mindset. That's something Michael Fullen said to me years ago. Engagement of students, time. I want to win back time. De-implementation will be key to this. Competing agendas, missing classroom implementation, working with site leaders to declutter, making PD meaningful, success criteria, success criteria, success criteria. I'm telling you, the more I engage in developing success criteria with audiences, the more meaningful my professional learning becomes. Bill, how to maintain a shared vision. The idea that we need, Alessandra, to always implement, always use a new methodology or different approach. I agree with you. We need to really look at what we're doing already, right? And try to become more impactful. How to progress writing in all students in the class. Inclusion takes up a lot of time. Buy-in for certain best practices to address learning gaps. Absolutely. We need to be able to use, in that case, Crystal, evidence that teachers trust. Tom Gusky told me a long time ago, if you want to develop somebody's self-efficacy, you need to have a protocol in place. You need to use evidence teachers trust, and the strategy needs to make a difference within weeks and not months. That can be very powerful. Supporting school leaders with streamlined, coherent, and high-impact strategies, helping aspiring principals, how to focus on what is important and avoid distractions. We need to change our reading practices. We have to introduce morning reviews into a cluttered curriculum. So thank you for putting that, because this is something Tanya and I worked on together when we were working on the book. As you know, she's my editor. And you think about these educational trends just in the past 30 years. And if you've been around for a long time, you've seen a lot of these. I started teaching in 1995. So these are all things that I'm very, very, well-versed in. And some of them are really good. Some of them are things that should fall by the wayside, right? It kind of depends on what we know about research and how impactful they are in our own practices. So one of the things that was asked earlier, and I think it was Alessandra that asked me maybe, about how does this medical profession research actually correlate with education? This was one of the ways that I found. So I started to look at medical implementation science, and it was all about understanding the organizational perspective. Now, in many cases, they had doctors and nurses where it says organizational perspective. And on the right-hand side, they had patients. I changed it. That's why it says adapted. What we need to look at is, what are our interventions? What are the organizational characteristics? Do we truly understand that? Do we really understand that? You know, a trend I see among students or with students is to do empathy interviews with our students and understand what are the barriers to learning. I think we should be doing empathy interviews with the adults as well. It's actually something that I use in workshops with adults. When it comes to teachers, what are the barriers to your teaching and learning? One of the things on here that's always important, and this is the connection between the medical research and education, is that when I've used this prism, which you can see the name of it on the side, on the left-hand side, what leaders and teachers tell me is the hardest part is the whole idea of maintenance. It's the idea of maintenance. And maintenance is something that a lot of school leaders will say, we just don't do a great job with. And why? Because we're always going after that shiny new toy. And sometimes what we need to be able to do is honor what we're doing in our school already. And Lisa Mead, a good friend of mine, thank you. I am glad you like the empathy interviews. They've worked out really, really well so far. What we know from research is that Peter Drucker, a long time ago, this is not new. It has a different name. It comes from medical research. But even Peter Drucker was talking about this in the early 1990s. And it's that idea of planned and purposeful abandonment of the old and unrewarding, right? And that's the thing, Alessandra, exactly. If it's not broken, then we don't need to fix it. We don't always need to chase after the next thing. What we need to do is actually look, how can we inform the work that we're already doing already? So number one is the research. De-implementation is simply the process of abandoning low-value practices. And this is a part that people often get confused by. I just wrote an article for ASCD, Educational Leadership, on this. And abandoning existing low-value practices is not always easy, because sometimes people really love the practices. I was just talking to somebody today that said that they have a teacher that does parts of the body, even though it's not even a part of the curriculum or the standards. And yet this teacher is still upset that they don't have enough time to teach But the reality is they're teaching some things that isn't even within their curriculum. So that abandonment of existing low value practice, yes, Crystal, change can be really hard. And that's what you wrote in the chat box. It absolutely can, believe me. So I just put this in today because we can do this the easy way or we can do this the hard way. So this is what I want you to think about when we're thinking about de-implementation. De-implementation is the abandonment of low value practices. And there are really two ways that I've designed for it to happen. Number one is an informal de-implementation. And you can see at the top of guiding statements, I can make this change on my own. This is not something I need a team to do. You can go in tomorrow morning, or those of you that are in Australia this morning, you can go in today and start looking at this. Some of it is setting boundaries around emails. I know that sounds crazy, but the reality is I've spent a lot of time with people that said they check email, they check these things too often. So one of the abandonments that I'm trying to do is hang up my phone at a certain time, not checking my email a million times a day. There's a superintendent that I know that has an email notification that says, I check email at 8 a.m., noon, and 5 o'clock in the evening. After that, I go home to be with my family. Like setting that is really important. Some of the other, like I had some people that just told me the other day, they're de-implementing time tests in math because they have found through research that it's not really effective. Or taking out certain vocabulary from standards because they found out that there was too much. I'm actually reading a really great book, Differentiation in the Brain, which is really awesome, from David Sousa and Caroline Tomlinson. They were talking about some research that showed fifth grade classroom. They looked at the standards that the state said, these are the standards for fifth grade. And it would have taken, and I'm not exaggerating, 3,000% of a teacher's time to actually teach those standards. So it's about making sure that even the informal de-implementation might be something where you're working with a smaller team, your grade level team, on those kind of things. Like, what are some essential standards that we can focus on instead of thinking we have to focus on all of them? Setting boundaries is really important. And Bill even said in the chat box, but it's something that I've talked about in collective efficacy, and it's something that I've talked about in de-implementation too. I'm so tired of people saying teachers need to take an opportunity to breathe. You need more than an opportunity to breathe. You actually need to have time. You need to be able to get some of that time back, and setting boundaries. Family time is incredibly important. So that's something from an informal. So we've got de-implementation in itself is the abandonment of low value practices. And now it comes down to two things: a formal de-implementation or an informal. Informal, you don't need a team. Now for formal, you do. The change requires a team. You can see shifting middle school science program. In the de-implementation book, I actually went deeply, and Tom Gusky was very helpful with me, went deeply into the idea of going from traditional grading to standards-based grading. So I want you to know the reason why I said we can do this the easy way or we can do this the hard way is that, yes, there are certain elements to de-implementation that can be really easy, that we can start to chip away at on our own, the informal. Then there's parts of de-implementation that are a little bit more of a challenge. I even put pacing guides, which is not something I had done in the past. That's something like traditional grading to standards-based grading, or getting rid of zero tolerance policies and replace them with more equitable stances when it comes to discipline. So that's informal versus formal. Now, what we need to be able to do is, and Nicole, yes, is this the idea of working smarter, not harder? Yes, it is. I've always been a big fan of working smarter, not harder. And Nicole, I mean, yes, you're going to have those times where you're working hard, of course. But the thing for me, Nicole, is that when I'm looking at this, I think to a certain degree, we've always done de-implementation in the classroom. I taught first grade. And if something wasn't working with 30 first graders, they were going to let you know pretty quick. And I'm pretty sure I was de-implementing on the spot. So de-implementation is something that we have been doing, I think, but we kind of lost our way with it. Now, in order to actually look at the abandonment of low-value practices, in an effort to look at that formal versus informal de-implementation, One of the pieces of research that I found was very, very helpful came from the school psychology, actually. And so this is a journal of school psychology in Canada. And the criteria that Farmer et al. Actually set up is this. And I want you to take some time to think about this. So if we're going to go and say we've got this adaptive challenge and we want to focus on de-implementation and we want to abandon low-value practices, and we're looking at formal and informal de-implementation, in the book and in the work that I do around this, you have to have criteria. Because if you don't have a common language and a common understanding, you're not going to get very far. We often have a common language in schools, but we don't have a common understanding. So when we're looking at low-value practices, those are these. The ones that have been shown, have not been shown to be effective and impactful. And I think just like at the beginning, when I had you do that short data talk, there are ways that you can find the data to help you engage in that data talk at your school to understand what has not been effective, right? Those that are less effective or impactful than another practice. Do we need to keep doing all of them? Or can we start to streamline? And much to some of the things that came up in the chat box from earlier, a lot of them were the ones that feel like they're imposed, and that certainly has come up because I'm working with school districts that have a lot of initiative. We start to look at this. How do we streamline these? How do we look at the ones that are actually impactful? Which ones are less effective that we don't need to do anymore? Some that cause harm. Zero tolerance policies are ones that research shows causes harm. Taking kids' recess away, those are things that have been shown in research to cause harm. Or some that are no longer necessary. And I'm going to give you an example, but I can't hear the collective groan. No longer necessary. What if I said contact tracing? I was at a workshop. I had about 350 people. I was in Georgia one time. And one of the things that I talked about it when it came to those that are no longer necessary, I said contact tracing, and I heard the whole group just go, oh. And I said, exactly. You don't need to do it anymore, right? So that's no longer necessary. That's a huge example. But there must be other ones, right? Mary Beth Taylor, as a school leader, would you recommend teachers identifying both success criteria and low-value practices? Yes, Mary Beth, and I would want you to be a part of the conversation. Because when I'm working with schools on low-value practices, you're asking a really good question, and that's the common language and common understanding. What is low value to one person might not be low value to another. In fact, in the book, which is probably like one of the, I did a lot of the checklist type of thing. I created a de-implementation checklist for people to go through and actually check if it's not effective or it's no longer necessary or low value. What does low value mean? And identify that language together. Yes, Jody, what should we keep doing, stop doing, and start doing? Absolutely. And that is very simple. In fact, when Tanya and I were thinking about a title for the book, we almost didn't use de-implementation. We almost did just stop. But we decided that probably wasn't going to be the best way of doing it. But I just want to highlight what Mary Beth is saying because I think it's really important for us today. We need to be able to identify what low value practices are with our staff. And it's an important conversation to have. Now, de-implementation also, besides the partial reduction and besides the formal de-implementation and the informal de-implementation, it really comes down to two other areas. There's a partial reduction and there's a replacement action. In the medical research, they had 4, but even in the medical research, they said that a couple of them could be combined. And that's what I did here. Partial reduction and a replacement action. And in order to show you what those are, here are some examples. Examples of partial reduction. Why reduce it? Meetings. I hear from a lot of people that meetings, there are just so many meetings, and some of them overlap greatly. And quite honestly, in the collective leader efficacy work that I'm doing, I know that we have meetings and there are people sitting around the table that don't even know why they're there in the first place. Email is something that I already talked about. I don't expect you to stop checking email. And I know this is a low-hanging fruit, but the reality is what we need to start looking at is how can we partially reduce it? Can we set up boundaries to say, have automated emails to say, 8 o'clock, noon, 5 o'clock in the evening. That's when we check email. After that, we go home to be with our families. I'm working with teachers right now that are actually looking at their assessments. They said that, and they were very honest, and I appreciate the fact that they felt like they could be so honest. They actually said that they realized they were over assessing students, and then they weren't even looking at the assessments after they were done. And they said that they could just get as much information from using other methods of instruction and also minimizing some of the assessments. Now, some of the others, for those of you that are looking for more of that instructional piece, I'm always going to be a big fan, and I need you to know I'm not judging people on this because this is something that I have done myself. Teacher talk versus student talk. When I'm running workshops these days, what I try to do is about 50% of the talking with the content and offer 50% of the time for processing information. And I use protocols. Janet Clinton of the University of Melbourne in Australia has research that she's conducted over the past decade or longer that showed that worldwide, on average, teachers ask 200 questions per day and students ask 2 questions per student per week. What can we do in replacement of that? Cooperative learning, collaborative learning, things like using reciprocal teaching and that kind of stuff. So that's something. Homework. There are countless studies that show the ineffectiveness of homework. And that doesn't mean we get rid of it. It just means that we look at, can we partially reduce what we actually expect our students to be able to do? So this is where I'd like to take some questions, and we're going to use the chat box for this before we move on, because these are examples of partial reduction. So I want to give you some time here. Brian, you wrote, I have students identify all the assessments that take place in their school or grade level. Many are amazed when they see the list. Then they talk about how little they do with the data once completed. That's right. So I'd like to, if you have some questions for me right here. So just to reflect a little, de-implementation is the abandonment of low-value practices. Some of the ways you can get into those conversations is through success criteria. There are 2 ways to look at de-implementation. There's the informal de-implementation, something you can use that you don't need your team, and a formal de-implementation, something that would be a team. And now we have these 2 other pieces. We know that we've got the criteria behind de-implementation, which is, those things that are not working as effectively as it could, or they're actually harmful, or we don't need them anymore. And then when we start to look, we can look at the fact that we've got a partial reduction and we've got a replacement action. So for those of you sitting there, who has a question before I move on to the replacement? And I do have a place in a couple of slides where you're going to be able to do a little bit of a protocol for me just to process. Over assessing, Cynthia, yes. Our 8th grade students will be tested via local and state level for a total of 16 days a school year. That seems excessive to my math mind. Cynthia, I was one of 8 principals in New York State back in 2011 that wrote a letter against the New York State Education Department saying that we shouldn't be tying standardized test scores to teacher evaluation, and very vocal about that. It's not that I don't think assessment is important, but I think it's about what are we using to assess, and are we overly assessing students because we're not doing anything with it? So Brian, how do we as educators really review all the assessments we give? And some have been district or school driven and have real conversations about their value. Brian, I think you set up a psychologically safe place where we do that. In the collective leader efficacy work that I'm doing, that's part of what I focus on, which is, it's about having those conversations about those practices that we can actually engage in that are going to be meaningful. Catherine Blackmore, there are very strong opinions about homework. Oh, yes. And some of them are actually from parents, because I remember as a principal, I had parents that got upset with me because they wanted their children to have more homework. Donna Watson, good evening from North Carolina. I don't know if it's the same Donna Watson I know, but I will say hello no matter what. Meetings should be meaningful, Crystal, and should produce something staff can use. Yes, that's where I focus on collective leader efficacy, because I want people. I'm amazed sometimes when people come to workshops and they don't even know why they're at the workshop. That's another reason why I use success criteria. So, Crystal, your comment is important there. Use a formative assessment needs to be given more value margin. Absolutely. I noticed map assessments on the trend slide. Thoughts? I'm not really sure about that, actually, Mary Beth. I'm not sure I can answer that. I'm sorry. I think I might need more information. Jody, we spend tremendous resources on benchmarking tests without time or structure to review the data. I was talking to somebody at the district office who's the data director of data, and they talked about how they use a PowerPoint and they speak to the principals for 45 minutes and then give them 10 minutes to process the data. That needs to flip. Leah, how much of de-implementation is based on values? Sometimes people have an easier time. I'm not going to answer that one, Leah, because you're leading into one of my questions. So thank you for putting that, but I promise I will definitely come back to that. I wonder if teachers overtalk because they lack the quality pedagogy to engage students. I also think, Cassandra, it's because when we're talking, we're in control, and that feels good. Really interested in these examples, Peter. We've struggled in our work to look at some of these, as there seems to be a fine line between de-implementation and implementation. Absolutely. Or just adjusting homework, for example. That's absolutely right. And actually, at the beginning of the book, and I'm glad you actually mentioned that, Susanna, so thank you for putting that. When I showed you the PRISM model at the beginning, that was all about implementation. And one thing that I didn't say that I shouldn't have, so Susanna, I'm glad that you did, is that de-implementation, I believe and have written, is just as much about implementation as it is about abandonment. It's about simultaneously, when you're looking at abandoning things, being more conscious about what you're taking on in the first place. I know in the past year and a half that I've been learning about the topic and writing about the topic. That's one of the things, even running workshops, that I look at. What can I get rid of? What can I partially reduce? But what am I going to be very careful to take on in the first place as well? Lots of chatter at school or at home. That depends on how much technology is available and if it works. Yep. Paul, thank you for being here, Paul. Flip faculty meetings, then use success criteria for other curriculum work with the time saved. Yes, so there's a lot of things in there as well. So hopefully I helped answer, or at least highlight and honor your voices in the chat box. I know it's hard in an hour webinar when you can't always unmute. The second is that of replacement actions. And I actually talked about one of these already, which is zero tolerance policies. When we're looking at also at de-implementation, the abandonment of low value practices and partial reduction and replacement, formal versus informal, one of the things that I really started to look at quite a bit is off-campus professional development to site-based PD. And I know that sounds strange coming from a person that actually runs professional learning, but a lot of my relationships these days are monthly. So I am doing maybe 3 times in person with the group, and then the rest of the time we're doing 3-hour webinars together every month. And I use Mentimeter to keep track of what we're talking about. We even actually, and you're going to see this at the end, we even develop a theory of action as individuals. So when we're looking at the off-campus professional development to site-based PD, one of the things that I would want you to think about, Vivian Robinson and Helen Timperley are 2 of my favorites. And they both come from New Zealand. And one of the things that we really have to start to look at is it valuable for us to send our educators out to conferences? I'm not knocking conferences. I don't want people to get mad at me. But all I'm saying is that, and I speak at very few conferences these days because my work is monthly. And what I think about there is, and it's not even about working with a consultant on a monthly basis, It's the idea of, instead of spending a lot of money to send them out to one-day PD that might not be used when they come back, what about that long-term PD that you can use where your faculty meetings and your school leadership team meeting and your walkthroughs are all working together? I'm working with a group in Maine. And one of the things that a teacher talked to me about, because I talked about the value of roles on the instructional leadership team, one of the things that came up is a teacher said, Peter, I don't get paid to be on this leadership team. And she actually said, and she was very polite, but she said, I don't get paid to be on this leadership team. I like to be on this, to be in the know, but if this is going to take me away from my teaching duties, that's going to be a problem. And I said, the problem is you don't see a direct correlation between what you talk about at your instructional leadership team meeting and your faculty meetings with what you do in the classroom. And that's where I think we really miss out. We can't always get that from the off-campus PD. It's about making sure, and this is what I'm doing when I coach leaders too, making sure that our faculty meetings are aligned with our instructional leadership team meeting, and they're aligned with how we talk about walkthroughs and learning walks and formal observations. So that's a little bit of implementation and de-implementation, right? It's about partially reducing and sending people out to conferences, but also implementing a better way to focus on learning. Some of you were talking about maths and, reading, literacy, everything. These are things we should be talking about at those meeting spaces. Nicole, thank you for being here. I appreciate it. So this is what I want to know, and I'm going to go back to, and maybe it was Nicole that brought it up, but what I would like to know is, what is one formal de-implementation you could take on tomorrow? And Leah, it's you. This is where I'm going to come back to what you said, Leah. What is one informal de-implementation that you could take tomorrow? Julie, so thank you for putting that in the chat box. Yes, leaving by a certain time. And you know what? You shouldn't feel badly about it either, because you do deserve to have a personal life. You do deserve to spend time with families. Email boundaries, absolutely. Lisa Mead, email, and I'm going to test you on that too by emailing you and see if you reply. Mary Beth, I try to make staff meetings meaningful, but it seems when I clearly lay basic information in email, it's not read or absorbed. How do I make time for staff? I think honestly, Mary Beth, you're probably not going to love my answer, but you send it out in an email, and people need to be responsible to be able to, if it's not too long, to be able to read that and understand. Just as long as we're not over emailing them in other areas. If this is like a really important news and notes that goes out on a Monday morning, I think that's a place to put it. Adding an automated response. Alessandra, if you get in trouble, it is not my fault. Check email at set times, actual meetings to classroom. Short sound bites. Let's see. In Mentimeters, set specific times for working on grading late homework. Yes, love the idea of managing emails. Email, do not disturb times, leaving by a certain time, checking emails less often, more regular start and finish times to my day, putting important information in monthly newsletter communication tool. And let me bring this back to student learning, because I want people to look, and sometimes people look at email and they're like, that's not the big stuff. You know what? Sometimes it's the small stuff that kills us. So when we can partially reduce these things, right? Do not disturb times, email management. When we can carve time and say, we're going to check it at these 3 times during the day, it gives us more space to spend our focus doing something else. For example, I will tell principals, put in your calendar, get up out of your office and go into classrooms and do walkthroughs. Stop checking email and have that calendar time. Monday, Wednesday, Friday. I used to go into every classroom every morning to see the kids, and then I would go back and circle through an hour each day. Not everybody has that luxury. So when you can calendar Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and that's when you're going to do walkthroughs. And I have some YouTube videos about the difference between walkthroughs and learning walks. One of the things that I want you to think about is when you set those boundaries with email, it gives you more time to do that stuff. It gives you more time to have one-on-one conversations with people. What else is in here? Determining if something is busy work or adds value. I have to be honest with you, something as simple as leaders that I work with and coaching, I will have them make a list of everything that they're responsible for doing. I do this with instructional coaches as well. Write a list of everything you're responsible for doing, and then highlight the things you like to do the most, and make sure you try to get to those every day, because a mindset thing is going to change. The other thing, determining if something is busy work or adds value. I want you to think, are you even sure that you're supposed to be doing it? I will remember years ago, it was like 7 years ago, I was running a workshop for Jim Knight on instructional coaching in a large district in North Carolina, and I had about 150 instructional coaches. And it occurred to me in the conversation that they were all talking about these different things they were doing. And as instructional coaches do, they have a lot of duties as assigned, or even take on duties that aren't assigned. So I had them do a job list. What is your job? And I wanted to see, what is your job? So take chart paper and write what your job description actually is. There were a lot of things on the chart paper, and they had it done by school, hung it up on the wall. And the next day I was working with their principals. And I said, I want you to do a gallery walk and see what instructional coaches list as their job duties. The principals started to walk around and they would look at their instructional coaches' job duties, and they were going, but I don't want them to do that. I don't want them to do that. So I want you to also think, when we're looking at the abandonment of low value practices, informal versus formal, partial versus replacement. Are you taking things on that you're not even supposed to be taking on in the first place? Are we doing this to ourselves? And Leah, to answer your question, 100% of the time when I was doing the research behind this, and I put this up on the screen, 100% of the time, people listed something that they felt was being done to them, not something they did to themselves. They weren't looking at their own practices. They were looking at the practices they felt like were being imposed. And a part of this discussion, a part of the abandonment of low value practices, a part of getting rid of the noise is the idea that what we have to be able to do is start to look at what are those things we're doing in our classroom that we don't need to do either. Setting a time aside each day to read something professional, to learn and grow as a leader. But you know what? I'm also going to say setting a time aside each day, something that's not professional and that you would like to read. Uninterrupted summer vacation time. I would eliminate mandatory homework and switch to choice boards. That's wonderful. All right, Brian, the death of education. We're always done it this way. That's right. Absolutely. And Megan, yes to admin being present with the students and staff. And I know, Lisa, email can be such a time suck which makes it the big stuff, only have much time. Okay. And this, Leah, goes back to what you were asking me before. We often want to throw out the activities that we believe are thrust upon us rather than questioning our own practices. And whatever you take away from this evening, what I want you to think about is just to look at your practices and say, do I need to implement that? Just because it was on Twitter and somebody that I like tweeted it out, do I really need to do that? Or if you're a school principal, if you're going to see somebody give a keynote and they seem like they're telling you the next best thing, are you so sure that it's not already happening within your school? It's just a small pocket of people are doing it. Wouldn't you rather explore it with them instead of always listening to that person? I always want people to go back and explore how these things are being done already. All right, so the practice. Now, I have a very simple cycle of de-implementation, and this is actually where we're going to shut it down because you can learn more about it. I have YouTube videos that talk about de-implementation, so you could just Peter DeWitt and my name, well, that is my name, and you can put in de-implementation, they'll come up there. I've written articles on it already as well. There's the book, but it really comes down to inquiry. What's my theory of action? If we do this, then what are we hoping? We talk about theories of action, but the reality is they're if-then statements. And I want you to think about it from everybody who's here tonight. If you're going to engage in a partial reduction, then what do you hope is going to happen? If I engage in a partial reduction of checking email, then I'm going to have more time to focus on one-on-one conversations. That's the inquiry part. I often use a program logic model when it comes to the book. And then it's about de-implementation. Like I said, there's a lot of work in there about a de-implementation checklist. There's also, pacing guide and those kind of things as well. And then, of course, evaluate. And that's, back to the whole idea of evaluate. Did this have a positive impact on students when we engaged in this? But did we also feel like we could breathe a little bit better? Did we feel like we had a little bit more time? We shouldn't feel anxious all the time. I'm reading a great book on lost connections by Johann Hari. And the more we pummel people with do this, do this, do this, the more they're going to become disconnected from work. At the beginning of our time together, I told you about Odetola's research. Students are alienated from us for two reasons. They don't feel like they have a voice in their own learning, and they don't have an emotional connection to their teacher. The same can be said for the adults. If a teacher doesn't feel like they have a voice in their own teaching, or if they don't have an emotional connection to their school, they're going to be more likely to leave us. And that's why I think just engaging in the discussion about de-implementation and then trying one step is what's important about all of this. Any other questions? We can use Mentimeter. I know we only have 2 minutes left. We could also use the chat box, but how about this? We're going to use the chat box because Tanya is going to do a giveaway. Tanya, I'm going to turn it over to you. All right. Thank you, everyone, for being here.
Have a good night, everyone, or morning.